Victoria Harrow's voice sliced through the hush of the premium cabin like a blade. Some of us paid extra not to sit next to that noise, she snapped, glaring at Elena Ruiz as Mateo shifted restlessly in his seat. Passengers turned, their eyes ricocheting between the polished diamonds glittering on Victoria's wrist and the faded janitor's uniform Elena still wore, straight from her second shift. Elena didn't flinch. Her reply was measured, soft, and cold as steel. Air pressure affects babies differently. He'll calm down, faster if you stop making a scene. For a flicker of a moment, the power shifted. The CEO's wife wasn't used to anyone speaking back, and the stunned silence of the cabin hung heavy. If you've ever wanted to see arrogance crumble right before your eyes, you'll want to subscribe now. Because this flight, it's about to prove exactly why status means nothing when real crisis strikes. Elena adjusted her grip on Mateo's blanket, her eyes steady, unshaken by the muttered laughter from two suited men across the aisle. She'd been through worse storms than this. The truth of who she once was, what she once carried in her hands every single day, stayed buried. Let them think she was just a cleaner. Let them underestimate her. Her son tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering, "Mama, I'm thirsty." She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her movements patient and deliberate. The small toy stethoscope he insisted on carrying rolled from his lap, clattering to the floor. A flight attendant bent quickly to pick it up, pausing with a faint smile before placing it back in the boy's hands. Nobody noticed the way Elena's jaw tightened, the way memory lingered like a phantom every time she heard the hollow plastic tap against her son's chest. This was more than a flight to her. It was a test of how much humiliation she could endure before her son's dignity cracked alongside her own. And Victoria Harrow, with her designer scarf and perfectly styled hair, had just chosen the wrong woman to treat like dirt. Where are you watching from? Because the moment Victoria laughed, Elena knew. This was only the beginning. And when the stakes turned deadly, she would be the last person anyone expected to stand. The announcement chime dinged, and Elena leaned back, pulling Mateo close. His small body shifted restlessly, still sensitive to the pressure change as the plane climbed. She whispered comfort in Spanish under her breath, words the world had nearly taken from her after years of backbreaking night shifts and silent mornings scrubbing tiles. Across the aisle, Victoria called for another glass of champagne. Her laughter rang hollow, every movement a performance. She tucked the blanket tighter around her infant daughter, who slept soundly in her carrier, oblivious to the storm brewing just 3 rows back. The baby's cheeks glowed with the soft flush of sleep, an innocence that felt like a bridge across a canyon, though neither woman could admit it yet. Passengers began to settle. Laptops clicked open, earbuds slid in, lights dimmed. Elena closed her eyes briefly, a moment of stolen peace. But the words from earlier still burned. That noise. She'd heard it before. In cafeterias where she mopped floors, in offices where she emptied trash, even in her last hospital shift years ago. Except back then, she was the one doctors called when a baby's monitor alarm screamed red. Nobody on this plane knew that side of her. Nobody knew the letters after her name, the endless hours in NICUS, the weight of tiny lungs learning how to breathe. The turbulence began subtly, a shiver through the metal body of the aircraft. Mateo startled, clutching tighter to her arm. Elena steadied him with calm certainty, whispering, "It's just bumps in the sky." Across the aisle, Victoria gave a sharp laugh. "Dramatic, isn't she?" she said to the man beside her. "Holding that boy like the world's ending." Elena let it slide. Pride meant nothing when you were raising a child alone. Dignity lived in the way her son's heartbeat slowed when he rested against her chest, in the way he trusted her arms as the safest place on earth. But the flight wasn't finished testing her. A cough, then another. Sharp, wet, jagged. It came not from Mateo, but from the tiny infant swaddled against Victoria's silk blouse. The noise drew attention, faint at first, but growing as the baby's breaths turned ragged, shallow, wrong. Victoria's smile faltered. The man beside her reached for the call button. The flight attendant hurried forward. Elena's eyes snapped open, her training returning like lightning to her veins. She didn't move, yet. Not yet. This wasn't her moment. But it was coming. Elena's eyes remained fixed on the baby across the aisle, her ears attuned to each labored breath. The attendants fluttered nervously, one crouching low beside Victoria's seat, another rushing toward the galley to fetch something, though it wasn't clear what. Victoria's composure cracked into frantic whispers, her jeweled hands clutching the infant tighter, as if diamonds could shield fragile lungs from closing. Mateo stirred in Elena's lap. His small hand tugged at the bright red stethoscope toy lying crooked on his blanket. "Mama," he murmured, "should we help?" His words were innocent, but they lodged in her chest like a question no one else dared to voice. Elena's fingers brushed the toy absently, the smooth plastic strangely heavier now. She didn't answer him. Not yet. The instinct to move, to rise and take control, pulsed beneath her skin. But she forced herself to stay still. Timing mattered. If she rushed in, she would only draw more ridicule. She'd learned the hard way. Dignity wasn't in proving herself at the first chance. It was in knowing when to act, so no one could deny the truth. The attendant returned with an oxygen mask clearly designed for adults, fumbling to fit it over the infant's tiny face. The seal was loose, the flow uncontrolled. Elena exhaled quietly, her professional eye seeing every error in seconds. Still, she didn't move. Instead, she reached into her bag and withdrew a small bottle of water for Mateo. "Sip slowly," she whispered, her voice calm, grounding him while chaos rose around them. Her son looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes, as if he sensed she was holding back something enormous. Across the aisle, Victoria's voice rose into sharp edges. "This isn't working. She's still coughing. Why don't you people know what to do?" Her panic carried, echoing through the cabin and drawing passengers from their screens and books. Some leaned into the aisle. Others whispered nervously. The pristine cocoon of first-class luxury cracked under the weight of a single infant's struggle. Elena glanced down at the toy stethoscope again. A memory pressed against her. Nights under sterile hospital lights. The weight of real instruments around her neck. The soft, fragile chests she'd pressed them against. Babies who had only hours unless someone acted fast. Babies who had survived because of her hands. Mateo followed her gaze. "Mama," he said softly. "Like before?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the echo of stories he half understood, the life she rarely spoke about. "Yes," she said finally, meeting his eyes. "Like before." She slid the toy back into his hands, letting him cling to it as though it were an anchor. Symbolism mattered. For her, it was a reminder of the world she'd once commanded. For him, it was proof his mother was more than what people saw in her uniform. Victoria continued to bark at the attendants, her frustration spilling into blame. "I want a doctor. Now. Someone here must be qualified." She turned, eyes scanning the passengers, searching for help wrapped in wealth and status. What she missed was sitting only 3 seats away, the woman she had dismissed minutes before. Elena kept her posture calm, her expression unreadable. To anyone watching, she was just a mother, soothing her child during a turbulent moment. But beneath the surface, the story was different. Every detail, her measured breathing, her watchful eyes, the way she cataloged symptoms silently, was the shadow of her old life resurfacing. The murmurs grew louder. One passenger muttered, "Why doesn't someone do something?" Another added, "Aren't flight crews trained for emergencies?" The weight of expectation shifted restlessly among them. Elena could feel it pressing closer, circling her seat like invisible hands urging her to rise. Still, she waited. This wasn't yet the moment to reveal herself. The arc of dignity required patience. The arrogance had to ripen. The dismissal had to deepen. And Victoria, blinded by panic, would soon hand her that opening on a silver platter. Matteo pressed, the toy against his own chest, listening as if he could hear something beyond the hollow plastic. He smiled faintly, unaware of how his small gesture mirrored her past so precisely. Elena's throat tightened. She had tried to bury that life, to live quietly. But fate was unearthing it, piece by piece, through her son's innocent hands. The cabin lights dimmed further as the attendants rushed for guidance, one speaking frantically into the intercom. "If there's a medical professional on board, please come forward immediately." The call echoed through the plane. Silence followed. No one stood. Elena tilted her head, eyes narrowing as she watched Victoria's panic mount. In another few seconds, she would have no choice but to rise. But not before the humiliation circle closed. Not before the same woman who had called her "that noise" realized she was begging into a void. Matteo shifted, curling closer against her, his toy clutched tightly in his fist. He trusted her calm, unaware that the very expertise that steadied her now was the storm about to rewrite the course of this flight. The plane hummed steadily through the clouds. Breathless moments stretched thin, each one a test of restraint. Elena sat in the middle of it all, quiet, steady, invisible to most, yet holding the single thread that could decide life or death. And when she finally moved, there would be no undoing the truth. The silence that followed the announcement was suffocating. Every passenger seemed frozen, waiting for someone else to move, to rise, to carry the burden of responsibility. Victoria's frantic gaze darted from row to row, her face pale, her jeweled hands trembling as her baby's cries weakened into strained whimpers. Elena's pulse thudded in her ears, steady, controlled. She had heard those sounds before. The rasp of an infant whose airway was narrowing, the ragged pull of lungs desperate for air. Memories of monitors flashing red and nurses shouting filled her mind, but she pushed them aside. Here, on this plane, there was no team, no sterile room, only chaos. Matteo shifted against her, watching with wide, anxious eyes. "Mama," he whispered, clutching the toy's stethoscope tighter. "No one's helping." His voice cracked with innocence, carrying across her heart like a plea. Elena laid a calming hand on his shoulder, her thumb tracing circles the way she had done countless times when he was a baby. Across the aisle, Victoria's voice grew shrill. "Where's the doctor?" "There must be one here." "Don't just stand there. She can't breathe." The baby's tiny chest rose and fell too fast, the soft flush on her cheeks fading into a frightening shade. Gasps spread through the cabin as passengers realized this was no ordinary fussing. It was real danger. A flight attendant crouched again, trying to read instructions on a laminated card, fumbling with the oxygen tubing. Her hands shook, the mask slipping again and again. Another passenger leaned, into the aisle, muttering, "Isn't there anyone who knows what to do?" The murmurs grew, a tide of helpless voices pressing in. Elena's body leaned forward instinctively, but she stopped herself just short of rising. She could feel the weight of humiliation still lingering in the air, the sting of Victoria's earlier words echoing like a taunt. Not yet. Not until every alternative had collapsed. Victoria snapped her head toward the attendants, her voice sharp with desperation. "Call the cockpit. Tell them we need to land. Now!" She clutched her baby tighter, rocking her in frantic, jerky movements that only made the infant's gasps more strained. The sound drilled into Elena's chest like a knife. She knew those movements weren't helping, knew they were wasting precious seconds. Matteo looked up at her again, his small voice trembling. "Mama, you could—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. His eyes said it all. He believed in her, even when the rest of the world only saw a janitor. Elena breathed deeply, steadying herself. Timing. Dignity required timing. Let them see the cracks in their perfect world. Let them feel the collapse of their certainty. Only then would her intervention carry its full weight. The baby's cries dwindled into weaker sounds, each breath more strained than the last. Victoria's panic turned to open sobbing, her face streaked with tears, her words tangled in pleas. "Please, someone help her." Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some rising halfway before sitting back down, paralyzed by their own inexperience. The suited man who had laughed earlier pressed a hand to his mouth, guilt flashing in his eyes. The cabin had transformed into a stage of silent witnesses, every eye drawn to the unraveling drama. Elena's hand tightened around Matteo's small fingers. Her calmness wasn't resignation. It was precision. The discipline of someone who had faced crises, where every second mattered. She rose slightly in her seat, her gaze locking on the attendants. Their eyes were wide, desperate, looking for direction, for someone to tell them what to do. But still, she waited. The intercom crackled again, the attendant's voice faltering this time. "If anyone on board has medical training, please, make yourself known." The tone was no longer firm procedure. It was begging. Victoria's voice broke into rawness. "I don't care who just saved my baby." Her earlier arrogance dissolved into helplessness, her jewels and silk and demands stripped bare. For the first time, she wasn't performing. She was simply a mother, terrified of losing her child. That was the moment Elena chose. She straightened, her back tall, her expression calm, her presence suddenly commanding in its quiet certainty. Her voice cut through the panic, low but firm. "Move aside." The attendants turned instantly, startled by the clarity in her tone. Victoria blinked at her through tears, her earlier disdain replaced with a desperate hope she couldn't hide. The passengers leaned forward, holding their breath. Elena crossed the aisle with Matteo, clutching the toy stethoscope, following like a shadow. She crouched beside Victoria's seat, her eyes already scanning the baby's color. Her breathing pattern, the ineffective mask lying limp across her tiny face. Every instinct sharpened to a point. She didn't explain herself yet. She didn't need to. The precision of her movements spoke louder than words. She adjusted the baby's position, tilted her head gently, cleared the airway with practiced care. The infant's gasp turned sharper, then steadier, though still fragile. Gasps echoed around the cabin, relief mixed with disbelief. Someone whispered, "She knows what she's doing." Elena didn't look up. Her focus was absolute, her hands steady as stone. She was no longer just a janitor on a plane. In that moment, she was exactly who she had always been beneath the uniform. The woman who carried fragile lives in her hands and refused to let them go. Mateo's toy stethoscope dangled from his fingers, forgotten for now. But its presence lingered, a symbol, a reminder that truth always finds its way into the light, no matter how long it's buried. Elena's hands moved with the calm authority of someone who had been here countless times before. She tilted the baby slightly, clearing the airway, steadying the head, adjusting the mask with practiced precision. The infant's chest began to rise more evenly, the desperate rasp easing into shallow but steady breaths. Relief rippled through the cabin like a wave, soft gasps and murmurs breaking the silence that had held everyone hostage. Victoria's jeweled fingers trembled as she clutched the edge of her seat. Eyes locked on Elena. The arrogance that had once dripped from every gesture was gone, stripped away by raw terror. Will she be all right? She whispered, her voice small now, fragile. Elena didn't answer immediately. Her focus remained on the baby, her fingertips resting lightly against the infant's chest, feeling the rhythm of life returning. She knew better than to promise certainty. Instead, she murmured instructions to the flight attendants, her tone low and even. Hold the mask here. Not too tight. Angle it. Yes, like that. Let her draw in the oxygen herself. The attendants followed instantly, their earlier fumbling replaced by sharp obedience. One nodded quickly, eyes wide with something close to awe. The authority in Elena's voice was unmistakable. It wasn't guesswork. It was mastery. Passengers leaned into the aisle whispering, "She knows what she's doing? Who is she? Wasn't she just sitting quietly with her son?" Curiosity blended with admiration. A shift in the air as the woman once dismissed as invisible became the center of attention. Mateo, still holding the toy stethoscope, watched his mother intently. His small chest swelled with pride, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with recognition. He had always believed she carried something greater inside her. Now the rest of the world could see it too. Elena glanced up briefly, meeting his gaze. That connection, silent but fierce, steadied her even more. Everything she had done, every sacrifice, every humiliation she had endured. This was the reason, for him, for the child who trusted her without hesitation. The baby's breathing steadied further, the frantic gasps fading into quieter, rhythmic sounds. Color began to return to her cheeks. Victoria let out a shaky sob of relief, tears streaking down her perfectly powdered face. She looked at Elena as though seeing her for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, her earlier venom replaced with something bordering on reverence. But Elena didn't soften. Not yet. Dignity required more than a hurried thank you whispered in panic. It required recognition, a reckoning for every word that had cut her down only minutes before. She remained composed, her voice steady, as she continued to guide the attendants. Keep her upright. Watch her breathing. If it falters again, we'll need to improvise further. The words weren't for Victoria. They were for the baby, for the crew, for the invisible thread of responsibility Elena had carried long before this flight. A suited man who had laughed earlier cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Elena, guilt written across his face. Another passenger murmured, "Incredible! She saved that child." The tide of opinion was shifting, the public stage now favoring her. Dignity inching its way back into her hands. Victoria pressed her hand against her baby's chest, relief flooding her features. "She's breathing, thank God." Then, almost reluctantly, her eyes rose to Elena. How did you know what to do?" Elena's gaze was unreadable. She didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she adjusted the blanket around Mateo, her movements calm, almost dismissive. She wasn't here to explain herself. The truth would come in its own time. And when it did, it would carry the weight of every moment that had led here. Mateo leaned close to her, whispering proudly, "Mama, you fixed it." His words rang louder than any passenger's whispers. They were the validation she needed, spoken from the one voice that mattered most. Elena smoothed his hair gently, her lips pressing into the faintest smile. "I did what I had to," she said softly. And beneath that simple phrase lay the ocean of her past, the long nights in NICUs, the desperate parents clinging to hope, the knowledge that had never left her hands even when her career had been stripped away. The attendant straightened, one of them nodding to her with quiet respect. "We'll monitor her closely," he said, his tone carrying a new deference. Elena inclined her head slightly. The acknowledgement accepted, but not flaunted. The plane hummed steadily, the tension easing as passengers returned to their seats. Though their eyes lingered on Elena, whispers followed her like shadows, speculation swirling. She ignored it all. Her focus stayed where it belonged, on Mateo, on the steady rhythm of life she had preserved in the baby across the aisle. Victoria remained silent, her hand stroking her daughter's hair with trembling fingers. The transformation in her demeanor was stark. No longer the untouchable CEO's wife, but simply a mother shaken to her core. And though gratitude had flickered in her eyes, humiliation still lingered in Elena's memory. Elena knew this wasn't over. A single crisis didn't erase years of arrogance or the sting of being dismissed like she was nothing. The reversal had only begun. Dignity wasn't restored in a single breath. It was reclaimed piece by piece, witnessed by those who had seen it stripped away. As the cabin settled into uneasy quiet, Elena leaned back into her seat, her son curling against her side. The toy stethoscope slipped from his hands onto her lap, its bright red tubing coiled like a symbol of the truth still hidden. One day soon, she thought, they'll know. Not just what I can do, but who I really am. The engines roared softly as the plane pushed through the clouds, steady once more. But beneath the calm exterior, the storm of revelation was still building, waiting for the moment when her hidden past could no longer stay in the shadows. The toy stethoscope rested in Elena's lap, a quiet symbol of everything unspoken. The cabin had calmed, but the air still held the weight of what had just happened. Passengers shifted in their seats, some stealing glances at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect, others whispering softly about the transformation they had just witnessed. Mateo leaned closer, his small voice breaking the silence between them. "Mama, they were scared, but you weren't." His eyes shone with admiration, his innocence carrying the kind of truth no adult dared to say aloud. Elena brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her heart aching with a quiet pride she rarely allowed herself to feel. Across the aisle, Victoria cradled her baby protectively. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands still trembling, but her posture had shifted. The polished elegance was gone, replaced by the raw fragility of a shaken mother. She looked at Elena more than once, as if trying to piece together who this woman really was. But the words stuck in her throat. The attendants hovered discreetly, their glances toward Elena no longer dismissive. One of them bent close, whispering, "If you don't mind, would you stay nearby? Just in case." The tone carried respect now, a quiet acknowledgement of authority. Elena nodded simply. No flourish, no pride, just agreement. Her dignity was not in boasting, but in knowing her worth, whether others saw it or not. Passengers resumed their routines, though the atmosphere remained altered. Laptops reopened, magazines rustled, But conversation lingered around the incident. One older woman leaned to her companion, whispering, "I thought she was just, well, look at her uniform." But the way she handled that baby? The words carried across the aisle, reaching Elena's ears. She pretended not to hear, but Matteo caught them, his small hand tightening around hers as though to anchor her. He tilted the toy stethoscope against his chest, pressing his ear to the hollow plastic bell. "I can hear myself," he said with a grin, "just like you used to." Elena's throat tightened at the words, her mind flashing to nights long ago when real stethoscopes had hung heavy around her neck. Nights when she had bent over fragile infants, her own heart racing as she listened for the faintest signs of survival. One of the men in suits, the same who had smirked earlier, leaned into the aisle toward her. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. Are you in medicine?" His tone was cautious, laced with curiosity. Elena met his gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "I was," she said simply, her voice carrying both finality and weight. No further explanation, no invitation for more questions. Just the truth, condensed and sharp. The man blinked, nodded, and sat back with an awkward shuffle, as though humbled by the simplicity of her words. Victoria's lips parted slightly at Elena's admission. She swallowed, her eyes flicking between her daughter and the woman who had just stabilized her. But pride and shame tangled together, locking her in silence. Gratitude warred with embarrassment, and for now, she said nothing. Matteo's curiosity, however, was unfiltered. "You were a nurse, right? For babies?" His words carried across the quiet aisle, innocent and direct. Passengers turned again, ears pricking at the revelation. Elena placed a finger gently against his lips. "Later, Carino," she whispered, her tone gentle but firm. Her son nodded, though confusion clouded his young eyes. The whispers began anew, speculation sparking like embers among the rows. She used to be a nurse? That explains it. No wonder she was so calm. Each fragment reached Victoria, surrounding her in the judgment of strangers. The humiliation she had dished out so casually earlier now circled back, invisible, but sharp. Elena leaned back, her eyes closing briefly, as if drawing strength from within. She knew this wasn't the full reveal. Her past was not a story to be tossed out like gossip. It was a truth to be shown, piece by piece, until even the most arrogant could no longer deny it. Matteo fidgeted with the toy again, tapping it gently against her arm. "When I grow up, I want to use a real one," he whispered. His words slipped under her guard, soft but piercing. She pulled him close, pressing her lips against the top of his head. "Maybe you will," she murmured, her voice carrying both hope and sorrow. Across the aisle, Victoria's baby stirred but did not cough. The tiny chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, a fragile sign of peace. Relief etched across Victoria's face once more. Though shame still lingered in the way her eyes darted away from Elena's. The suited man who had mocked earlier shifted again, this time leaning toward a flight attendant. "We should make sure she's recognized," he said quietly, nodding toward Elena. The attendant only nodded, already aware that recognition had begun the moment Elena's calm hands saved a life. For Elena, though, recognition wasn't the goal. It was dignity. And dignity came not from applause or whispered praise, but from the quiet certainty that she had not been broken by their scorn. She had remained who she was, even when no one else could see it. Matteo tugged her sleeve once more, his eyes bright. "Mama, can I tell them you were the best one? Better than anyone here?" His words tumbled out with childish honesty, sparking smiles from nearby passengers. Elena chuckled softly, pressing a finger gently to his lips again. "Not yet, Matteo," she whispered. "Not yet." But inside, she knew the truth was already seeping through the cracks of silence. The world around her was beginning to piece it together. And when the final moment came, there would be no denying who she truly was. Elena kept her finger pressed gently against Matteo's lips, a quiet reminder to hold his words. His eagerness to declare her greatness warmed her heart, but she knew the timing wasn't right. The cabin still buzzed with speculation, whispers swirling like invisible currents. It wasn't the moment to claim her past outright. Truth, she understood, carried the most weight when it arrived at the breaking point. Victoria's gaze lingered on her, furtive and conflicted. She looked down at her baby, breathing steadily now, and then back toward Elena. Gratitude flickered in her eyes, but pride choked it down. She adjusted her silk scarf, trying to reassemble the fragments of her composure, but the sheen of her earlier superiority had shattered, and no amount of luxury could mask it now. The attendants hovered closer to Victoria's row, taking subtle cues from Elena as they checked the baby's condition. Each small glance they cast toward her carried unspoken recognition, a silent admission that they trusted her judgment above their own. Elena caught one of those looks and offered the smallest nod in return, her authority confirmed in silence. Matteo traced the edge of the toy stethoscope with his fingers, restless. His whisper was meant only for her, though it carried the innocence of a child, unaware of the weight his words held. "They know you're different, Mama." Elena's chest tightened at his honesty. She squeezed his hand, answering only with a quiet, "Shh, Carino." Across the cabin, the suited man who had mocked earlier fidgeted uncomfortably. He glanced at Elena more than once, as though rehearsing an apology he couldn't quite deliver. His partner beside him muttered, "We were wrong," under his breath. Neither dared approach her, not yet. The shame of their earlier laughter bound them to their seats. Elena kept her expression neutral, as though untouched by their shifting opinions. But inside, she felt the subtle turning of the tide. Dignity wasn't restored in one instant. It gathered like water, drop by drop, until the weight became undeniable. The intercom crackled again, the attendant's voice steadier this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The infant in need of assistance is stable. We ask all passengers to remain seated as we continue monitoring." The relief that spread through the cabin was palpable, a collective exhale. Yet even as the announcement ended, eyes returned to Elena. The unspoken question hung heavy. Who exactly was this woman? Victoria dabbed her eyes with a linen handkerchief, her hand trembling as she stroked her baby's hair. For a moment, her mask slipped, revealing the raw fear she had endured. She turned toward Elena as though to speak, but the words caught again, tangled between humiliation and gratitude. Instead, she whispered only to herself, her voice barely audible. She saved her. Matteo shifted, resting his head against Elena's shoulder. His small body radiated trust, as if the turbulence of the world around them couldn't shake his certainty in her. Elena brushed a hand over his back, her calm demeanor a steady anchor amid the whispers and stares. Passengers resumed fragments of normalcy, but conversations carried a new undercurrent. A young man across the aisle whispered to his partner, "She must have been a doctor." The partner shook her head. "No, a nurse, I think." "Did you see how she handled the baby?" Their guesses swirled, each one nudging the truth closer to the surface. Elena listened without reacting. Let them wonder. The truth had more power when discovered than when declared. She had no need to prove herself. Not yet. The engines hummed steadily as the plane cut through the night sky. The steady rhythm soothed some passengers back into uneasy rest, though glances toward Elena still lingered. She sat tall in her seat, her son nestled against her, her expression calm. It was the same composure that had carried her through emergency rooms, through long nights where lives hung on the edge of her decisions. Victoria finally found her voice. It came hesitantly, stripped of arrogance. I owe you more than I can say. She didn't look Elena in the eye as she spoke, her gaze fixed on her baby's small hand. I thought I had everything under control. Her voice faltered, the words raw with the weight of realization. Elena didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate. When she did speak, her voice was even, without malice. Control doesn't matter when life hangs in the balance. The words landed softly, but carried the weight of truth. Victoria swallowed hard, her pride cracking further. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked directly at Elena. What she saw wasn't a uniform, wasn't a position of low status. It was strength, calm, unwavering, undeniable. The suited man across the aisle cleared his throat again, as though to fill the silence. "We should all be grateful," he said, his voice louder than necessary, almost defensive. "Not everyone could have done what she did." Passengers nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading. Recognition was seeping in, unavoidable now. Elena said nothing more. She simply adjusted Matteo's blanket, her focus returning to him. The toy stethoscope rested against his chest, its bright red tubing a quiet reminder of the life she had once lived, a life the world was beginning to glimpse, piece by piece. The storm wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. For the first time, the passengers saw her, not as a janitor, not as an inconvenience, but as the quiet force who had steadied chaos when everyone else faltered. And though Victoria's whispered thanks had cracked open the door, Elena knew the full reversal was still ahead. The truth of who she was and what she carried would rise fully in the moments yet to come. The cabin had grown quieter, but the silence wasn't peace. It was charged, heavy with what had just unfolded. Every time Elena shifted in her seat, she could feel eyes on her, watching with the kind of curiosity reserved for mysteries. The janitor who had been mocked minutes ago now carried the aura of someone far more significant, though the truth remained cloaked. Matteo leaned against her side, his breathing steady as sleep tugged at him. The toy stethoscope dangled loosely from his hand, a bright reminder of the past Elena carried like a shadow. She smoothed his hair, her calmness masking the storm building inside her. Dignity was not fully restored yet. One act of intervention had turned whispers, but the true test had not yet arrived. Victoria held her baby close, rocking her gently, eyes locked on her daughter's small chest. Relief lingered on her face, but fear still gnawed at her edges. Every few seconds, her gaze darted back to Elena, as if seeking reassurance without daring to ask for it aloud. Pride, Elena thought, was a stubborn barrier, harder to dismantle than panic. The attendants passed quietly between rows, checking on passengers, their movements subdued. When their eyes landed on Elena, they lingered for just a moment longer, subtle acknowledgement in their nods. They didn't need to ask questions. They had already recognized the truth in her steady hands and calm voice. The flight itself hummed on, engines droning against the night sky. But inside, tension still brewed. A shift had occurred. The passengers who once looked past Elena now studied her in quiet respect, piecing together fragments of her identity. It was a discovery unfolding slowly, fueled not by her words, but by her actions. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice hushed, but audible enough for those nearby to hear. She wouldn't be alive if it weren't for you. The confession slipped past her lips like something torn free, raw and reluctant. She lowered her eyes quickly, as though ashamed to admit it in front of witnesses. Elena didn't answer. She only adjusted Mateo's blanket, her expression neutral. The power of silence worked better than any retort. Her refusal to grasp at recognition left others to fill the void, to confront their own judgments. Whispers resumed among the passengers, carrying threads of speculation. She must have been in medicine, maybe military training. Who else could stay that calm? Each voice chipped away at the image of her as merely a cleaner, replacing it with something grander, though still undefined. Mateo stirred, blinking sleepily. "Mama," he mumbled. "They know now, don't they?" His innocent faith tugged at her heart. She bent low, kissing the top of his head. "They're beginning to," she whispered, her tone soft but steady. The suited man who had earlier mocked her finally mustered the courage to lean forward again. His voice was low, but his words reached more ears than he intended. "I was wrong about you." He cleared his throat, uneasy. "Everyone saw it. You saved that child when no one else could." His attempt at apology was clumsy, but the sentiment was real. Elena gave a small nod, neither warm nor dismissive. She accepted the words without granting him more comfort than he deserved. Recognition, she knew, wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, and something others carried whether they liked it or not. Victoria shifted again, her grip tightening on her baby as though she feared letting go. She opened her mouth as if to speak more, but silence swallowed her words. Her pride was still intact, wounded but not shattered. That final breaking point had yet to arrive, and Elena could sense it, waiting just beyond the horizon. The engines droned, steady and unchanging, a backdrop to the shifting dynamics inside the cabin. Elena leaned her head back briefly, closing her eyes. She allowed herself one breath of stillness, a rare luxury amid the scrutiny. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze swept the rows, passengers avoiding her eyes when she looked their way, guilt and respect mingling in their expressions. Mateo pressed the toy stethoscope into her hand. "Keep it, Mama," he whispered. His voice carried the kind of earnestness that pierced deeper than any applause. She curled her fingers around it, the simple plastic warming in her grasp. It was a symbol she had not asked for, but one she could not deny. A piece of her past, merging with her present, in full view of strangers. The baby across the aisle let out a small cough, though softer, now less desperate. Victoria stiffened instantly, panic flickering again, but her eyes darted to Elena without hesitation. That silent plea, unspoken but undeniable, hung between them. For the first time, Victoria acknowledged her dependence not on wealth or status, but on the woman she had scorned. Elena held her gaze for a long moment, her calm composure never wavering. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. Dignity was not granted by power or jewels. It lived in action, in resilience, in the ability to steady chaos when no one else could. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight pressed deeper into the night. Around her, passengers began to settle into uneasy rest, though the hum of whispers lingered. Elena remained still, her son nestled against her, the toy stethoscope resting in her palm. The reveal was only beginning. The crisis had not yet ended, and though she sat quietly, Elena knew the next test would demand more than calm hands. It would demand the full truth of who she was. The cabin settled into a hushed rhythm. But Elena knew it was the calm before another storm. Matteo had drifted halfway into sleep against her shoulder, his toy stethoscope tucked between them like a secret only they shared. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing her mind to rest, but her body stayed alert. Years of instinct had taught her to sense when a crisis wasn't truly over. Across the aisle, Victoria adjusted her baby, stroking her hair with trembling fingers. The child's breathing had steadied, but every tiny cough sent fresh panic through her mother's body. She glanced toward Elena often now, no longer with disdain, but with an unspoken dependence. Each look admitted what her pride still fought to deny, that her power meant nothing without the woman she had mocked. The attendants hovered nearby, their voices lowered, their movements cautious. One leaned closer to Elena's row, murmuring, "We've contacted medical support on the ground. They'll meet us when we land. But until then, could you stay alert?" His tone was deferential, almost reverent. Elena gave a small nod. "I'll stay close." She didn't need the recognition in his voice, but it carried through the cabin anyway. Passengers stirred again, whispers spreading. The woman they had ignored only hours ago was now the anchor of the flight. Matteo shifted, mumbling sleepily, "Mama, you're their hero." His words brought a tight ache to her chest. She smoothed his hair, whispering, "Not a hero, just someone who knows what to do." But even as she said it, she knew the truth was more complicated. She hadn't just saved a baby. She had begun to restore something inside herself that humiliation could never take away. The suited man who had tried to apologize earlier spoke again, this time louder, as though to cover his earlier shame. "We should all be grateful she was here," he said, gesturing toward Elena. His voice carried down the aisle, and heads turned. A ripple of agreement followed, passengers nodding, some even clapping softly. Elena kept her expression calm, though her hands tightened slightly around Matteo. Applause wasn't what she sought. Dignity was quieter, deeper. Still, the sound pressed against Victoria like a mirror. The same crowd who had once admired her wealth now turned their respect toward the janitor she had humiliated. Victoria stiffened, her lips pressing thin. The transformation in the cabin was undeniable, and she couldn't escape it. Her baby shifted again, letting out a sharp cry before coughing hard. Panic surged through her face instantly, and her eyes snapped to Elena, desperate now. Elena rose smoothly, crossing the aisle without hesitation. The attendants moved aside before she even spoke, their deference clear. She crouched low, her hands steady as she checked the baby's airway again. "It's all right," she murmured, adjusting the child's position with practiced care. The cries eased, the coughing subsided. Gasps of relief spread among the passengers once more. Elena glanced up briefly, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her, not with curiosity now, but with trust. It was the kind of trust she had once commanded daily, the kind she thought she had buried forever. Matteo watched her closely, his toy stethoscope clutched tightly. "Like before, Mama," he whispered, pride shining in his voice. Elena nodded slightly, though she didn't break focus. Her actions spoke louder than any admission she could make. Victoria's composure cracked fully. Tears spilled freely as she held her daughter, her voice trembling. "Please, don't leave her side. I can't." She cut herself off, choking on her own fear. Her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a mother begging not for status but for survival. Elena's voice was calm, steady. "She'll be fine as long as we stay watchful." She looked directly at Victoria now, her gaze unwavering. "But remember, wealth doesn't give you control. Life doesn't bow to power." The words were measured, not cruel, but they struck with undeniable force. Passengers shifted again, their eyes darting between the two women. The reversal was unfolding before them. The one mocked now stood tall. The one exalted now begged. The contrast was undeniable, and it carried through the cabin like a revelation. The attendants exchanged looks, their respect for Elena deepening. One whispered to another, "She's not just trained, she's experienced. You can see it." The word spread quickly, carried by murmurs from row to row. By the time they reached the back of the cabin, they had grown into a collective understanding. Elena wasn't ordinary. Victoria lowered her eyes, shame burning her cheeks. For the first time, she whispered, "I was wrong about you." The words were quiet, almost inaudible, but they marked the fracture of her pride. The woman who had mocked now admitted fault, if only in fragments. Elena didn't gloat. She returned to her seat with Matteo, her expression composed, her dignity intact. The toy stethoscope still rested in his hands, its bright red tubing glowing under the dim cabin lights. It was more than a child's toy now. It was a symbol of the truth seeping into the open, piece by piece. As she sat back, passengers began to murmur again. Some leaned closer to each other, whispering about her past. Others stared outright, waiting for her to explain. Elena remained silent. The final reveal wasn't yet. Timing mattered, and the climax had not arrived. Matteo's sleepy voice broke the quiet, carrying farther than he realized. "She's the best nurse in the world. My mama can fix anyone." The words, innocent and pure, landed across the cabin like a revelation. Gasps followed. Recognition deepened. The tide had fully turned, but the storm wasn't done. The truth was almost ready to emerge. And when it did, no one on that flight would ever see her the same way again. The cabin fell into stunned silence after Matteo's words. His small, sleepy voice had carried across the rows with a clarity that no announcement could have matched. Passengers leaned into the aisles, their eyes wide, their whispers immediate. "Did you hear that? She was a nurse. That explains everything." Elena's chest tightened, though her face remained composed. Her son's innocent declaration had pierced through the veil she had so carefully kept around her past. She smoothed his hair, pressing him gently against her shoulder, but it was too late. The truth had been cracked open. Victoria's eyes widened, her lips parting as the weight of the revelation settled in. She looked from Matteo to Elena, her breath catching. The woman she had dismissed as a janitor, mocked for bringing noise into the cabin, was someone who had once carried the lives of infants in her hands with skill and certainty. The suited man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice hushed but urgent. "Is it true? You were a nurse?" His words carried across more rows than he intended, drawing even more attention. All eyes turned to Elena now, pressing her into the center of the stage. Elena didn't answer immediately. She adjusted Matteo's blanket, her calm movements deliberate, her silence heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, steady. "I was," she said simply. "Pediatrics, intensive care." The admission hung in the air, undeniable, echoing through the cabin like a revelation. Gasps followed, and the murmurs returned with new intensity. "NICU nurse." That's why she knew. She saved lives before. The weight of her hidden past transformed the atmosphere completely. Respect replaced curiosity. Awe replaced doubt. Victoria's face flushed, shame coloring her cheeks as she clutched her baby tighter. Every arrogant word she had spoken earlier now replayed in her mind, each one a lash against the dignity of the woman who had just saved her child. She blinked rapidly, her voice catching as she tried to speak. I didn't know. I thought you were just..." She stopped herself. The words too cruel to finish. The silence that followed condemned her more than any insult could. Elena's gaze remained calm, but unyielding. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said evenly. "Respect shouldn't depend on a resume." The words struck deep, rippling through the passengers like a stone across water. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement spread. The reversal was almost complete. The attendants hovered nearby, their deference now open, their voices tinged with gratitude. "Thank you," one said softly, "for everything." Another added, "We're lucky you were here." Their words echoed the sentiment of the cabin. Recognition voiced in the presence of all. Mateo shifted, his small hand clutching the toy stethoscope once more. He looked up at his mother with eyes full of pride, his whisper carrying again. "See, Mama?" Now they know his words, innocent and unfiltered, sealed the truth in front of everyone. The suited man who had once laughed now lowered his head. "I shouldn't have judged," he muttered, his shame audible. A woman in the row behind him added, "None of us should have." The collective guilt of the cabin hung heavy, pressing against Victoria most of all. Victoria finally broke. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, her voice trembling. "I was wrong," she whispered, louder this time, audible to more ears. She turned to Elena fully, her pride shattered, her gratitude raw. "You saved her. You saved my daughter. And I treated you like you were nothing." Her voice cracked, the weight of humiliation folding her into herself. Elena's expression softened only slightly, but her voice remained steady, firm. "Your daughter's life mattered whether or not you saw mine as worthy. Remember that the words were not cruel, but they cut with truth sharper than any blade." The passengers shifted, their eyes fixed on Victoria now, judgment heavy in their stares. The reversal was no longer subtle. It was complete. The woman once exalted sat humbled in tears, while the janitor she had mocked sat tall, calm, her dignity restored in the presence of all. Mateo pressed the toy stethoscope into Elena's hand again, his smile sleepy but proud. "You're the best, Mama," he murmured, his words pure and unshakable. Elena curled her fingers around the toy, her calm gaze sweeping the cabin once more. Every pair of eyes avoided hers now, not out of dismissal, but out of respect, too heavy to hold. The engines hummed steadily, carrying them closer to the ground. But inside the cabin, something greater had already landed. Truth had revealed itself. The hidden expertise, the buried dignity, the quiet strength, all had risen in front of witnesses who could never again see her as invisible. Victoria lowered her head, rocking her baby, her voice a whisper of surrender. "I'll never forget this," she said, though her words carried more to herself than to Elena. It was not forgiveness she sought. It was absolution she knew she couldn't earn. Elena leaned back, her son safe against her side, the toy stethoscope clutched in her hand. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself the smallest breath of peace. Dignity had been reclaimed, not with pride or boasting, but with calm truth revealed in its own time. Elena opened her eyes slowly, the hum of the engines steady around her. The weight of silence in the cabin was different now, no longer dismissive, no longer filled with whispers of mockery. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that lingered when truth had forced its way into the open. Mateo slept soundly against her, his toy stethoscope clutched between them like a torch passed from one generation to the next. Across the aisle, Victoria rocked her baby gently, her eyes red-rimmed but calmer now that the child's breathing remained steady. Every so often she glanced at Elena, the shame in her gaze unmistakable. Each look was a quiet confession, a reminder of how far she had fallen in the eyes of those who had witnessed her cruelty. The passengers, however, could not remain silent. A woman 2 rows ahead turned in her seat, her voice firm but respectful. "You saved her life," she said aloud, addressing Elena directly. Her words carried down the aisle, and nods followed, murmurs of agreement swelling again. Another passenger added, "We owe you more than thanks." The applause began slowly, a ripple from the back of the cabin, hesitant at first, then spreading forward. Hands clapped together in unison, the sound echoing against the cabin walls. Elena sat still, her expression composed, her hands folded gently in her lap. She did not rise, did not bow, did not bask. Dignity was not in soaking up applause. It was in letting the truth stand on its own. Mateo stirred at the noise, blinking sleepily. "Mama, are they clapping for you?" he asked, his small voice rising above the hum. Elena brushed his cheek with her hand. "They're clapping for the truth," she whispered back. He smiled, satisfied, and drifted back toward sleep. The suited man across the aisle rose halfway, compelled by something larger than himself. "I laughed at you before," he said clearly, his voice carrying to all who listened. "I judged you without knowing a thing. I'm ashamed of it now. What you did tonight, none of us will forget." His partner nodded, her face flushed with guilt. The public admission sealed the moment. The humiliation Elena had endured earlier was now inverted, witnessed by all. The very voices that had once dismissed her now carried her vindication, restoring her dignity not in whispers, but in proclamations. Victoria's shoulders trembled, her pride unraveling thread by thread. She stood suddenly, clutching her baby, and turned toward Elena. "I mocked you," she said, her voice breaking. "I treated you as if you didn't matter. But you—" her words cracked into a sob. "You mattered more than anyone else on this plane." Gasps rippled through the cabin at her public confession. Passengers leaned closer, watching, their expressions sharpened by the rawness of the moment. Elena's calm gaze held steady, her silence giving Victoria's words more weight than any rebuttal could. The applause swelled again, louder this time, no longer hesitant but certain. The reversal was complete, witnessed, undeniable, etched into the memory of every person on that flight. Elena finally spoke, her voice low but carrying. "Respect should not come only after a crisis. Every person matters, uniform or not." The words hung in the air, stark and unshakable. Heads nodded across the rows. Even the attendants paused in their duties, their faces solemn with understanding. Victoria lowered her head, holding her baby tightly, her tears falling freely now. The image of her broken pride stood as a mirror to everyone else in the cabin, a reminder of how easily arrogance collapses when stripped of its illusion. Elena leaned back once more, pulling Mateo close, her composure unbroken. She had not raised her voice, had not demanded recognition, yet she had received it in full. Dignity restored itself not through force, but through truth, revealed step by step, undeniable in the end. The plane pressed forward into the night, its engines steady, carrying with it a cabin transformed. The passengers who had boarded in ignorance would disembark with a story etched into their memory, a story of arrogance undone, of a single mother who had been far more than they imagined, and of dignity reclaimed in full view of all. Mateo's small hand rested on hers, his toy stethoscope warm between their palms. He looked up sleepily, whispering, "I told you, Mama. They know now." Elena kissed the top of his head, her eyes closing briefly. "Yes, Matteo," she said softly. "Now they know." And with that, the flight carried them closer to the ground, closer to the world waiting below, where the echoes of this night would linger long after the wheels touched the runway. The roar of the engines continued as the plane cut through the night. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted permanently. The passengers who once looked past Elena now regarded her with open respect. Some still whispered about her revelation. Others simply sat in silence, the weight of what had unfolded settling into them like a truth they could no longer ignore. Matteo stirred again, curling deeper into her side. His toy stethoscope rested loosely between their hands, its plastic bell pressing softly against her palm. Elena let her thumb brush over it, her thoughts wandering briefly to nights in sterile wards, alarms flashing, lives hanging in the balance. She had walked away from that world for him, but tonight reminded her it had never truly left her. A chime rang overhead, followed by the attendant's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent. Please remain seated with your belts fastened." The announcement broke the hush, but not the mood. The descent signaled the end of the flight. Yet everyone knew what they had witnessed would not end at landing. The suited man who had spoken earlier leaned out into the aisle once more. "Before we land, I think we all should say it again," he said loudly, drawing eyes from every row. "Thank you." His voice wavered, but the sincerity was clear. Passengers joined in, voices overlapping until the sound of gratitude filled the cabin. Some clapped again. Others spoke her name, though she had never offered it. Elena inclined her head slightly, her expression composed. She hadn't done it for applause, but she allowed the recognition to wash over her, steady and deserved. For once, she didn't shrink into invisibility. She let the truth of her worth stand unchallenged. Victoria sat silently, her baby nestled against her chest, fast asleep now. The mother's face was streaked with tears, her makeup blurred, her earlier arrogance reduced to fragments. She looked across the aisle, catching Elena's calm gaze. Her lips parted, but words didn't come. It was not that she lacked them. It was that none seemed enough. The attendants returned, moving down the aisles with renewed composure. When they reached Elena's row, one bent slightly, speaking in a voice meant for her, but audible enough to carry. "Medical will be waiting when we land. But thanks to you, she's stable. You did more for her than anyone else could have." His words carried to the rows around them, further cementing her vindication. Matteo's sleepy eyes fluttered open again, and he whispered, "See, Mama?" They all know now. Elena kissed his forehead, her hand brushing back his hair. "Yes, Matteo," she murmured. "They've seen what matters." As the descent continued, the cabin lights brightened, reflecting against polished surfaces and weary faces. Yet the most striking contrast remained. Victoria, surrounded by luxury, visibly humbled, while Elena, in her worn uniform, sat taller than anyone else. The reversal was undeniable. Passengers began to prepare for landing, stowing belongings, buckling belts. But conversation circled back to her again and again. A woman leaned across the aisle to whisper, "You reminded us that worth isn't measured by appearances." Another added, "I'll never forget this flight." Their words weren't directed only at Elena, but also served as quiet indictments of themselves, admissions that they too had judged too quickly. Victoria shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many stares. She rocked her baby, her eyes lowered, shame pressing her shoulders down. Finally, she spoke softly, her voice audible in the charged quiet. "I thought money and status could solve everything. Tonight, I learned how wrong I was. The words weren't directed at Elena alone. They were spoken to everyone listening. A public confession, a dismantling of pride. Elena didn't respond with triumph. Her reply was calm, steady, dignified. Life doesn't choose who matters based on titles. We all matter. The sentence carried like a final lesson, one that left the passengers in reflective silence. As the landing gear lowered, the rumble vibrated through the cabin, but it couldn't shake the stillness of the moment. Passengers looked at Elena with something beyond respect now. It was reverence, the kind reserved for those who reveal the truth in action, not in words. Mateo pressed the toy stethoscope into her hand one last time before tucking himself closer. His whisper was soft, but sure. "I'm proud you're my mama." Elena's throat tightened, her composure nearly breaking, but she held steady, her hand closing around the toy with quiet strength. The runway lights gleamed faintly through the windows as the plane descended lower. The crowd who had once laughed, mocked, or ignored her would disembark with a new story written on their hearts. And Elena, the janitor they had dismissed, would walk off with her dignity, not only restored, but amplified, witnessed by every single soul on board. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the cabin shaking as the plane rumbled across the runway. Passengers braced instinctively, hands gripping armrests. But Elena stayed steady, one hand wrapped around Mateo and the other still holding the toy stethoscope. As the engines roared their final surge, silence fell again. Not from fear this time, but from reflection. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Please remain seated until the plane comes to a complete stop. Medical staff will be boarding shortly." The attendant's voice was composed, but beneath it was a current of relief. Everyone knew why the medical team had been summoned, and everyone knew who had carried them through the wait. Victoria adjusted her baby, who now slept peacefully against her chest. Her eyes were swollen from tears, her scarf askew, her jewels dulled in the harsh cabin light. She looked across the aisle at Elena once more, shame and gratitude battling in her expression. She opened her mouth, but hesitation silenced her. The passengers, however, were not hesitant. A man in the back spoke aloud, his voice cutting across the cabin. "We saw what you did. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than who you are." His words sparked nods, then quiet affirmations, spreading like a wave. Another passenger added, "This flight won't be forgotten." Their voices blended into a chorus of respect, unpolished but genuine. Elena inclined her head slightly, receiving their words with grace. Dignity wasn't in boasting, it was in letting recognition come freely. Mateo sat up straighter, pride radiating through his small frame, his hand clutching hers as though to anchor the moment. The suited man who had earlier confessed his shame turned toward the rest of the cabin. "She saved a life when none of us could. That deserves more than thanks. It deserves change." His voice was firm, resonant. For the first time, Elena felt the weight of not just respect, but the potential ripple of something larger. Victoria rose slowly, her baby still in her arms. She faced Elena fully, no longer hiding behind pride. Her voice shook, but her words were deliberate. "I judged you. I mocked you. And I was wrong." She swallowed hard, her tears fresh. "I'll never undo the cruelty of my words, but I will never forget the strength of yours." The cabin fell into silence again. Every eye locked on Elena, waiting for her response. She looked at Victoria, her expression calm, her voice steady. "Your daughter is alive. That is what matters. Learn from this, because respect isn't a privilege. It's a duty." The truth landed heavily, undeniable, leaving Victoria unable to do anything but nod, humbled beyond words. The plane slowed, engines whining as it taxied toward the gate. Outside the windows, flashing lights approached. The medical team waiting to take the baby for further care. Passengers gathered their belongings slowly, their eyes still fixed on Elena, reluctant to let the moment pass without holding on to it. Matteo leaned against her again, whispering proudly, "Everyone knows now, Mama. Everyone!" Elena kissed the crown of his head, her lips trembling just slightly. "Yes," she whispered. "They finally see." The attendants opened the door, and the medical team boarded swiftly. They moved to Victoria's row, taking the baby gently into their care. Victoria stepped aside, watching with wide, fearful eyes, then turned back to Elena. She bowed her head slightly, not just in thanks, but in surrender. Elena gathered her bag, tucking the toy stethoscope safely inside. She rose with Matteo at her side, walking the narrow aisle with a calm dignity that filled the space. Passengers leaned back to make way, some murmuring quiet blessings, others nodding with respect. Each gesture was a reversal of the humiliation she had endured at the start. As she stepped into the jet bridge, Matteo squeezed her hand. "Mama," he said softly, "does this mean they'll never forget?" She smiled faintly, her voice low but firm. "They'll remember, Matteo, not because of who we are, but because of what was right." Behind her, the whispers continued. A single mother, a janitor, a woman dismissed and mocked, who had risen in a moment of truth to restore not just a baby's breath, but her own dignity before all. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. And for Elena, that was enough. Now tell me the next story title you'd like us to bring to life. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in comments, what injustice should we tackle next?